Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And in this video, and assuming the Tories have finished imploding again for a few hours, I'd like to catch up with the news this week that an academic study has shown that Brexit has added £6 billion onto the cost of our food in just 2 years. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So it should have been obvious that Brexit would increase food prices. Brexiteers in the media are trying to diminish the importance of this study by saying, oh, we get most of our food from around the world now and it's cheaper as a result. Absolute twaddle. Nothing about raising trade barriers with our European neighbours has allowed us to somehow get cheaper food from elsewhere. The food imports that we are buying from countries outside the single market are charging us the same price as we would have paid from inside. All that Brexit has done is raise the cost of our imports from the EU. It's a little bit like trying to climb a wall. You go to a wall and it's like 5 metres high. You go, oh, that's a little bit high. There's this much lower wall that's only 1 metre high. That was being in the EU. We climb over that, no problem. And now all of a sudden, that EU wall is 10 metres high. So the 5 metre high wall doesn't look so bad now, but it's still a 5 metre wall. You know, it's not even hypothetical that food prices could have come down. It's like, how would that going to work? If you raise trade barriers, you make trade more expensive. That is the whole point of trade barriers. It's to raise the cost of trade. Up until recently, there were really only two main reasons to raise trade barriers. The first is when the governments running two different markets weren't getting along, you know, having a bit of a Barney. It might be a case of war or economic sanctions being applied to encourage or discourage certain behaviours. Or secondly, you raise trade barriers to protect businesses inside your own market. Brexit sits outside of these reasons. We applied the economic sanctions against ourselves. You know, name me one country in the world where it's now cheaper to import food from since Brexit. One. There isn't any. In fact, the cost has actually gone up because the value of the pound has fallen a lot due to our decision to leave the EU. So in a sense, it might seem ridiculous that the London School of Economics had to carry out an academic study to determine that Brexit has indeed increased the cost of food. In fact, I've seen people say as much. It's a bit ridiculous that they had to waste their time on this, but there is a good reason for it. There are, of course, multiple pressures on our trade. There always are to a certain extent, but the last few years has been it's gone a little bit crazy. You know, we've had the pandemic, Russia's war in Europe. They've all created two of the most severe impacts, but you've got climate change, political instabilities in other parts of the world as well, all contribute. And Brexiteers love to point at the other causes and go, yeah, the problems are down to that. And it's like, no, some of the problems are down to that. Some of them are down to Brexit. Without Brexit, we'd have still had the other problems. They wouldn't have gone away. But we wouldn't have had the Brexit problems on top. So it's actually really important to work out the quantitative impact of each of the pressures on trade. Because up until now, it's basically like saying, well, you know, this has had an impact, this has had an impact, this has had an impact. And this has probably had the greater impact than this or whatever, but we don't quite know the number. Well, the research has now shown that leaving the EU added an average of 6% to household bills, food bills, over 2020 and 2021. So that is, of course, before Russia escalated their war, because that was this year. You know, another point made clear in the report is that because poorer households spend a larger proportion of their income on food, Brexit is disproportionately harming the poor. Because the inflationary effects of Brexit have hit the very things that poorer households have to spend more of their income on. It's all very well people on 5-figure or more incomes dismissing the impacts of Brexit. Oh, not that bad. It's not that bad for you. You can afford it. And some of the more vocal ones are even grifting money out of it. Half of the GB News team would be unemployable without Brexit. And as I've said before, if it was just making the cost of living go up a bit, Brexiteers might get away with their attempts to dismiss what they claim are short-term problems. If like people were going, the price of this has gone up a bit, I've gone up a bit, they could say to them, don't sweat it. This is just short-term turbulence. In the long term, give it 20 years and you'll be fine. They go, all right, then we'll see. It doesn't matter that they'll never come. The Brexiteers will have amassed enough money to retire by the time that becomes apparent. But the problem is that doesn't work so well now, because it's not just that people are seeing a drop in income that they can consider an investment for the future somehow. They actually can't cope. They haven't got enough money. So when you've got someone who already cannot afford the cost of living, to be told that Brexit's adding, say, 6% onto your food bills, or, this amount onto this or this amount onto that. And it's like, it doesn't matter that there are other factors responsible for part of that inflation. It doesn't even matter that, say, Russia has created more of that in food inflation right now than Brexit. That won't last. Brexit will last. And we did Brexit to ourselves. So the government could do something about it to reverse it. Everyone agrees that they're probably doing what they can in terms of Russia. They're not doing what they can in terms of Brexit. That Brexit has added a significant cost to an already tight budget. That's problematic for those trying to defend this pointless project. I mean, just to give you an idea of how bad things are, on the BBC News. I mean, the BBC News is now reporting on some more aspects of Brexit, frankly. They even discuss this. But there's a video article on the BBC News website about foraging for people struggling to make ends meet. We're a G7 nation, for goodness sake. We're one of the richest, most advanced economies in the world, apparently. And our national news broadcaster is hinting that if you can't afford to eat, maybe you should go out into the forest and find something edible, like a bloody hunter-gatherer. People say Brexit's taken us back to the 70s or even the 60s. It's taken some people back to the Stone Age. This is on top of all the well-meaning but ultimately stupid articles on supposedly cheap meals. I saw another one again on the BBC. Getting Michelin-starred chefs to come up with like cheap things. They all look very lovely. They look very nice. But it's like, and they may be cheap compared to other meals that look nice. They're not genuinely cheap. Like pretty much the cheapest thing you could do is something like egg or beans on toast. If you can't afford to have that on a daily basis, do you know what? Food budgeting ideas don't help. The likes of the BBC would be providing more of a service if they told those of us who can afford to eat just how bad it is for those who can't, instead of perpetuating this idea that all the poorest need to do is be a bit wiser about budgeting to help the rest of us sleep at night. Another thing in this LSE article is it makes clear that we have more NTBs between the UK and the EU. That's non-tariff barriers. This is important because Boris Johnson and his Tories kept insisting, we had, this great tariff-free deal. We've got this great tariff-free deal with the EU. It's great tariff-free deal with Japan. It's great tariff-free. Tariff-free, the focus was on tariff-free. So trade would be fine because we've got this tariff-free deal. Well, people kept trying to say, but the tariffs were really low anyway. And tariff-free deal with the EU, we had a tariff-free deal with the EU, as well as with the other non-tariff barriers. But they kept denying it. It's only, and also with the EU, it's only tariff-free for goods that we can prove were mostly made in the UK anyway. And even then, if we uphold our terms of the agreements, which right now we aren't doing. That's for exports. For imports, same thing applies. But non-tariff barriers are actually more serious, really. We've got much more paperwork. We've got more transport delays because people have to check the paperwork and the goods sometimes. More transport costs with the EU, not only because of the increase in the price of fuel, but a British lorry driver is not allowed to carry out loads of stops in the EU thanks to third country cabotage rules. So now they have to charge more because they can carry out fewer deliveries. But globally, if you're talking about rest of world trade, that massive increase in the cost of fuel is of course massively increasing the cost of transport from those countries as well. And the trade barriers are still not fully implemented in either direction with the EU. It's true that the EU have applied full import controls, that is customs and standards controls, but their biometric checks for third countries haven't come fully online yet. That's going to cause a mess on outbound traffic. As for inbound, we've barely begun to apply import controls on our side. This is costing us a fortune in lost import duties and threatening our food safety until we sort it out, which it doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Doesn't even seem to be a plan to make it happen. Very dangerous situation to be ignoring non-tariff barriers because it allows the government to keep agreeing like bog standard, because they'll talk about free trade agreements as if it sounds real. Oh, free trade, that's great, isn't it? A free trade agreement is pretty much the weakest form of trade deal you can get. They present it as somehow it's a good thing, and it's better than nothing. But there's not much in it. You know, I'll quote from the report here. Non-tariff barriers are an important impediment to trade that should be a first-order concern, at least on par with tariffs, for policymakers interested in low consumer prices. But our government focuses completely on tariffs, excludes completely the concept of non-tariff barriers, doesn't even talk about them, ignores them, even though they're evident. That suggests they either do not understand the importance, in which case it's clear they're deliberately failing to seek expert advice, because it's really easy to understand when someone explains it to you, or they don't care about how consumer prices can be afforded. They don't care about low consumer prices, in which case they're happy for tens of millions of people to live in poverty. And when Brexiteers try to talk about getting cheaper food from outside the EU, ask why we're doing more of that when we always had the option as part of the single market. Leaving the EU didn't make it easier for us to buy food from anywhere else in the world, not one single country. Didn't make it cheaper, not one single country. Because the reason why we're now buying some more from the rest of the world is because those non-tariff barriers are now more severe with the EU than they are for lots of other countries, like the heights of walls I was discussing. It's not that we lowered trade barriers between ourselves and the rest of the world, or indeed any part of the world. It's that we raised it much higher with our nearest and most convenient market. It's like the government literally said, where should we have our highest trade barriers? Should it be with countries we don't trade much at the other side of the world? No, it should be with the countries we trade most right next to us, because that makes sense. But the overall cost of food is still higher because we're now buying food at a higher cost than was the case before Brexit. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about food from Europe or beyond. So of course there was going to be an increase in the price of food with Brexit. It's just that before this report, people weren't quite sure just how much of the extra we were paying was down to leaving the EU and how much was down to other factors. Well, now we have a figure. But anyway, there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.